Is that post-mute?
Yeah, all right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I want to introduce Grugq. He's going to be giving a talk on the art of defiling, which is basically
it's defeating forensics analysis. I'm going to be using implementations on Unix file systems. However, these techniques are applicable on just about any operating system.
Excellent. Please turn off your cell phones and all the distracting devices. Otherwise, he's going to answer them.
All right. So as we've said, this is the art of defiling, defeating forensics analysis. I'm the Grugq. The basic agenda for today is I'll do a brief introduction about myself, some of what I do, and why you should give me money. Then we're going to look at forensics. It's important that you actually know something about the methodologies and processes behind forensics so that when we start looking at the attacks, you understand where the forensics process breaks down. Then we're going to look at some anti-forensics theory, like the broad strategies that you can use to implement anti-forensics attacks. And then we're going to look at some implementations, which is the anti-forensics in action section. Finally, there's a Q&A section at the end, and that's just buffer in case I really screw up on the times. However, if during the actual talk you have any questions, just shoot them out, and I'll try not to make too much fun of you. Okay, who I am, I'm the Grugq. What do I do? I break forensics tools, actually. It's a lot of fun, and not too many people do it, so it's very easy. Forensics tools tend to be written by idiots. I understand there's some people from guidance software here, and if you want to talk to me afterwards, we can meet in the parking lot. Why do I try and break forensics tools? Well, it started out about 4 years ago, or 5 years ago now, when I realized that there's a great deal of security research being done on just about all security technologies, except for some reason, forensics was this holy cow that no one would touch. It was viewed as sort of like it's only done by the good guys, the police and the feds. Well, okay, good guys to some anyway. But it was viewed as being done by the sort of law enforcement people, and they were either too stupid for us to worry about having to do it, or it was sacred and it didn't deserve any close scrutiny. And as a result, it's basically allowed to exist in this microcosm where there's no aggressor looking at forensics tools. So there's tons of bugs. In particular, there's a lot of format string bugs in Encase. Sorry, did I say that out loud? Okay. So we're going to do a quick and very, very rapid lightning tour of forensics. By the time we're done, everyone will have their head spinning a bit, but you should have the basic idea of how a forensics investigation is conducted. So this is our lightning tour. We bust out some random shit about forensics. Then we look at the digital forensics process, which we're going to be using the FBI-derived version, which is basically broken up into 5 parts. We'll look at how they're actually unified, but essentially we've got acquisition, preservation, identification, evaluation, and presentation. When we come to look at the anti-forensics principles, we'll be looking at how we can attack each of these phases and where the forensics process breaks down at each point. And then finally, we have a conclusion of some sort. Okay, so the general idea behind forensics is it's supposed to be in some way like the scientific method. So you come out and you come up with a hypothesis, and then you develop tests, and you test your hypothesis, and at the end you know whether you've come up with a valid hypothesis or not. So usually it's something along the lines of, is this guy in possession of child pornography? We say yes. We can search his computer. If we find child pornography, we can say, we have now proven our hypothesis. And if we don't, then we can probably slap him in jail anyway for something else. I have a bit of a pet peeve because people always talk about forensics analysis rather than forensics investigation. There's actually a difference. Analysis, as is conducted in the usual police world, is where the forensics officer is basically just a pure technician who works on any number of cases where they just give him a chunk of data and they say, find the evidence, and he finds it. He generates a report with the evidence and possibly an opinion, and he hands it off to someone else, and that person conducts the actual investigation. In the forensics world, what tends to happen, in the digital forensics world, what tends to happen is you have the investigator is also the person who does the forensics analysis. So he gets called in to do first response. He gets called in to do the incident response stuff. He has to do the acquisitions himself. He has to gather all of the data. He has to look for the evidence. He has to apply his own technical knowledge. And then from that, he has to extract all of the evidence, extract all of the stuff that's going to be relevant to his case. Then he has to build his own case, and then he has to decide what to do with it afterwards. So as a result, you get people who are less trained in the specific technical areas than they are in the vast procedural stuff surrounding all of that. So they can't actually specialize heavily in the technical areas. And when it comes for us to attack the forensics process, this is quite useful. So we know that the guy isn't very, very technical. He's probably really, really boned up on how to write a good report, which is, of course, one of the major things, which is the chain of evidence. So a huge part of forensics is actually all this legal bollocks. So they have a chain of evidence where, like, we acquired the disk on this date from this machine. These are the serial numbers. We conducted our acquisition where we created an image on this date. This is the hash sum. So-and-so was in possession of the disk at this time. Then we pass on. It's boring as hell. And the only reason they do it is because when it gets to a court case, they tend to attack this sort of stuff rather than the technical stuff. So anyway, forensics analysts, they're not very good. So the basic outline of what a forensics analyst is going to be doing, or a forensics investigator, is these three things. He's going to be doing data capture. This is where he tries to get absolutely everything that might have some relevance to his case. So depending on what he's looking at, this could actually amount to terabytes of data. The idea is you go out and you grab everything that could be relevant, and then you winnow it out later. Then you do your data analysis phase. This is where you take all of the crap that you've gathered up, and you try and figure out what's actually useful. This is usually the most interesting and technical part of the forensics analysis process. So this is usually what we're going to be looking at when we look at attacks, even though necessarily it's not the most effective in terms of staying out of court, or out of jail, as that may be. And then finally, you have to do something with it. So forensics investigations are conducted for a purpose, right? You don't just kind of randomly show up and go, I'm going to image this disk. It's always done to answer some sort of question. Were we hacked? Is this guy a pedophile? Is this related to some sort of drugs charge? Are these people terrorists? You're always actually conducting an investigation. You're trying to find something out. And once you're done with your forensics process, you should have a deliverable of some sort which addresses the investigation. So that's our final phase. The FBI makes it a little bit more complicated and uses big words instead. So the acquisition and preservation phase are actually the data capture phase. So this is where you acquire your image and where you create a hash sum, where you try and freeze it in a state so that you can verify it hasn't been altered during the analysis process. You then have the identification and the evaluation phase. The identification phase is where you look for things that look like they're important, and then you have a separate phase where you decide if they're important. I don't know why they broke that up, but anyway, so you've got two phases. And then finally, you have a deliverable, which is the presentation phase. So the capturing of data for later analysis is usually pretty straightforward. You can use DD, you can use encase, you can use all sorts of stuff. And there's data that's stored in a variety of different areas. So there's volatile and non-volatile data. The volatile data is things which is pretty ephemeral, such as memory and network traffic. Unless you're actually prepared before you begin your investigation, you're going to miss this stuff. So usually the stuff is missed, right? Usually people don't say, this box is going to get hacked, let's get it ready for the investigation. They come along a few months later and go, oh shit, this box was hacked, let's have an investigation. As a result, they tend to go after file system content. File systems are great. Like, everything gets stored on the disk. You can model the activity of the entire system. You can figure out what's going on. In theory, file systems are brilliant because they've got all the information there. What we're going to see is file systems are not trustworthy. They're as reliable as any log file that's written on a local disk in a non-encrypted form. Okay, so if we're doing our acquisition phase, this is where we begin our chain of evidence documentation, where we say we've captured and blah, 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 and hash summed, and it belonged to so-and-so, and we found it in this condition. Next, we create a bit-level copy. So all of our analysis is actually not going to be done on the hardware itself. It's going to be done on a copy of the image. So actually, when I teach the forensics course, I teach people to do it on a copy of the image. That way, when you fuck up, you still have the original copy to go back to, because you probably will fuck up. The bit-level copy means that if it can't be read by software, by the disk imager, it's not going to end up at a later phase. So we can basically ignore all of that like electron microscope crap, because that's not an issue unless you're facing the feds, who really, really care about it. Anyway, your preservation phase, very simple. You copy, you hash sum, and you write down when you found it, right? So labeling is pretty important at this stage. You also begin your analysis documentation. This is where you start writing down the hash sums that you're going to be looking at and so on. And of course, you continue your chain of evidence documentation. So if we look at the identification process, it basically goes like this. We start out with a bit stream, which we feed in at one end. We then convert our bit stream into some sort of file system representation. Our file system gets extracted and converted into files, and if we're lucky, we get the evidence. So we start out with a bit level copy, and we feed that into some piece of software. This software will then have a representation or an implementation of the file system based usually on some work done by an intern over his 3-month break for the summer, usually with very, very bad documentation. As a result, all of this is pretty relative, but basically the idea is we take this bit stream and we convert it into a file system. We can then go through and using the file system information, we can try and extract some data. So the idea is that we have total file system awareness. This software gives us access to absolutely everything that's happened on the file system. The reality is different, of course. But essentially, we can look at things like deleted content, so we can see anything that's been removed from the file system or unlinked from the directory hierarchy but still exists on the disk. We can look at OS-level files, so we can look at log files, we can look at binaries, we can look at that sort of stuff, and we can look at user files, so we can look at anything that's been uploaded or modified or left on the file system. And obviously, we continue our analysis documentation, so we say all the steps that we've taken and all of the stuff that we found. Now, once we've gone through and we've extracted all the deleted content and we've looked at all the log files, we've pulled everything together, we will then do our evaluation phase. So we'll have our overall concept of what the investigation is about, and we will feed in all of this evidence or all of this data that we believe is relevant, and we will try and figure out whether it actually is relevant, where it's particularly useful to our investigation. Occasionally, we'll find out that we need more evidence, that we need to go back and do our identification phase again, possibly targeted in a different region. So the identification and evaluation stages are actually iterative. You repeat them until you're done. Once we're done with this, of course, we've now finished our analysis documentation, and we can present our evidence. Usually, we present our evidence to a prosecutor who will then say whether we're going to take it to court or possibly we'll be doing it for an employee or a client, and we'll just give them a document telling them what happened or what we believe happened. So it could be an employment tribunal, it could be a client, it could be anything. And at this point, we can conclude our chain of evidence documentation because we've handed everything over. So that's it. Forensics is pretty procedural. It tends to be fairly strict in how you do things. They tend to be very strict methodologies, mostly centered around documentation and making sure that you're doing repeatable steps that don't modify anything. We've gone over the 5 phases: acquisition, preservation, identification, evaluation, and presentation. We've got a thorough understanding of them. And the idea with the forensics process is, of course, that it's reproducible. It's like anything scientific. If one person can do it, you could take all the steps that they followed and conduct it in a different laboratory and achieve the same result. So that's why usually the defense and the prosecutor both have forensics analysts go over the disk to come up with their own information. So we're now going to look at how we can break this process. So this has been my personal motto: reducing the quantity and quality of forensics evidence since 1999. Okay, brief introduction. So we're going to go over problems with forensics, and there's a lot of them. We're going to go over how we can attack the process, and then we're going to look at the broad strategies that we can use when we're attacking the process. So the idea of anti-forensics is you want to mitigate the effectiveness of a forensics investigation. And there's any number of ways you can do this, but primarily you want to do it by making sure that any evidence found is irrelevant or useless, or preferably no evidence is found at all. So we'll look at different ways that we can make that happen. There's various different people who use it. The one that's most famous is, unfortunately, pedophiles. These people are disgusting, and they're actually quite advanced and technical with how they go about doing their stuff. I've heard some pretty crazy stories about the lengths that they'll go to hide data, but anyway, we'll skip all of that. Hackers, we're interested in hackers. Most of the people who hack for a living or who do it professionally don't need to worry about this stuff. They probably have a statement of work which keeps them out of trouble, or occasionally they wander a little bit out of scope, and this might be useful. There's actual hackers. We'll look at why this doesn't make sense for actual hackers, because they're usually so elite that they're never going to enter the, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, anyone who gets caught by forensics is an idiot. Okay, and then finally there's dodgy employees who occasionally try to do stuff and then cover it up. Usually they don't know what the fuck they're doing. They're white-collar criminals, and they'll delete their Access spreadsheet or whatever, and then it gets recovered, and they freak out and confess. And there's also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is apparently quite sophisticated in their anti-forensics techniques. I've only heard via hearsay what they're doing. Apparently, they're using my stuff, which is pretty lame because it's several years old. I don't release the good stuff. So they're using public techniques, basically. So they're obviously not very impressive. Okay. Digital forensics. All right, let's look at the problems. Number one, digital forensics analysts have a very short amount of time. In the UK, for instance, the average investigation time is 2 days. That means you have 16 hours to conduct an analysis of possibly a 250 gig hard drive. These days, you could have a 400 gig hard drive. So from an attacker's point of view, if you have an attack that requires 17 hours to discover, you win, right? They spend the first 16 hours, they find nothing, and day 2, they have to move on. It's over. So this is a good thing for us. We have to remember that, like, the people that are doing this are under immense time pressure. In the UK, there's an 18-month backlog for cases, right? So if your hard drive gets seized, you're not going to see it for the next 2 years. Okay, the other problem is they're short on skills. Forensics departments in the police forces are viewed as cushy jobs and rewards for people who've done their time. So you put in your years on the force and you get rewarded with a place on the forensics team. All you do is sit around and push buttons in front of a computer all day. The joy of this is that the good cops who tend to make it here are good cops. They're nice people, but they're not really technical. It's not really their skill set. So they go on a couple of training courses, and they learn how to be forensic certified, and they know how to press buttons, and they know all the procedural steps that they need to take for a regular investigation. But they don't actually know how to do digital forensics. Okay? They know how to use a piece of software, which brings us to the next point. They are slaves to the tools that they use. These people don't understand file systems. They understand NCASE or the forensics toolkit or whatever it is that they're using. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They know how to push buttons and generate reports. This is great for us because if we can defeat their tools, we can defeat them. It means that all we have to do is find one bug in their tools that will prevent them from discovering stuff, and we can use this for years. No one's going to find it. I mean, I'm the only person speaking on this stuff, doing the more advanced file system specific attacks, and I don't release the good stuff because I know it's going to get fixed. So forensics tools have bugs, right? They've got really, really big, glaring, huge, ugly bugs. And they come into 2 different categories. So the first one is the traditional bugs that we're familiar with, such as the buffer overflows that you'll find in TCT and the sleuth kit, the various different format strings that you can use with NCASE, and so on. These are bugs that allow you to directly attack the forensic software that's being used. So a while ago, there was a buffer overflow in file with certain ELF binaries. This sort of thing is pretty classic as an attack platform. Usually, though, it's not the best way of evading detection, because if the guy's software keeps crashing, well, NCASE crashes all the time, so you might get away with that. But if the guy's software keeps crashing, there's a strong chance that he's just going to take the image and ship it off and have someone do analysis under a debugger. And if they debug their software and they look at your file system with the dodgy stuff on it, and they find out that there's a buffer overflow and that you're trying to exploit them, you're going to, 1, kill the bug, and 2, get captured, or at least be identified via your technique. So it's not a very, very good approach. Much better, I believe, is going after the file system implementation bugs. So when these people independently implement their own version of the file system software, they usually fuck up in a few ways. And the ways that they tend to screw up are, we'll look at how we can find them, but they tend to be pretty basic stuff. Like they will look at implementing just a very, very broad spectrum of the file system, and they'll skip a lot of the details. So as I've been telling people, the basic problem you'll have with a forensics tool is that you've got 2 options. You can either create a forensics tool that understands one file system very, very, very well, or you can create a forensics tool that understands more than one file system. And that means that you have to come up with a unified approach to file systems, which means that you lose detail. And when you lose detail, you lose data, and when you lose data, you lose evidence. So there's a lot of file system implementation bugs. We'll be looking at those with open source tools in a minute. So when it comes to attacking the forensics process, the important thing to remember is forensics is it's a security technology. It's just like anything else. You can attack it and you can study it in any way that you could attack and study a firewall or an IDS system. And it's as vulnerable as everything else. It's not magic just because the police use it. It's just It's the same stuff that everyone else uses, only applied slightly differently. The great thing is, because there's so few people actually looking at it, there's a whole lot of bugs. Halvar's analogy of a pond that gets overfished applies very well in this case. So what you have is a pond that has been underfished. There's still a lot of big, juicy bugs out there. Okay, so we're going to look at attacks for each phase of the forensics process. So the easiest one is attacking data capture. So we've got a couple of pretty basic stuff. The first one is don't arouse suspicion. Right? If it doesn't look like you're doing anything dodgy, and if it doesn't look like you're crashing the system frequently, and you don't actually get the system administrators to start poking around, you can skip the entire forensics process. Right? So this is the simplest thing you can do. Just use a decent rootkit. Make sure that you don't start overwriting things that are useful. Don't let the box go down too frequently, and you're okay. So the simplest step is actually to avoid the entire forensics process, and this is what most of the people out there actually do, is they try and be skilled enough that they're not going to attract attention. The next one, of course, is you can try and destroy the hardware. This is useful in certain circumstances. It's not very good if they bust down your door and you're sitting there with a ball-peen hammer smacking away at your hard drive. It's going to be a bit suspicious. And finally, you can eradicate the data. If the data isn't there, they can't capture it. So we'll look at a couple of techniques of making sure that there's no data left behind on the file system. There aren't any attacks against the preservation phase. It's primarily a documentation phase. I thought of a couple of things, but they're pretty much pointless. I actually forgot them. They're useless. Okay, so the identification phase and the evaluation phase. This is more interesting in that it's pretty technical stuff that we're going to be doing. So for instance, you could hide the evidence, right? So when they're conducting the identification phase to try and find something that's useful, they're going to look through and they won't see what they're looking for, and you're going to escape evasion or you're going to escape detection that way. So we'll look at some techniques for that. The easiest one, the one that I highly recommend, is you don't actually leave any evidence at all. Right? So you operate in such a way that when they come to do their identification phase, their acquisition phase will have failed. There won't be anything left behind for them to capture and look at. They won't be able to find what they're looking for. And the evaluation phase is pretty simple. It's where you leave things around and they can capture them, but they're encrypted. So they can't actually look at them. They won't be able to figure out what they're doing. There's also proprietary data formats. Like in the old days, people used to use modified versions of tar along with crypt so that they'd be able to capture like this huge blob, but they wouldn't know what the hell it was. They wouldn't be able to extract anything. They wouldn't be able to identify anything. It was just random data. The presentation phase is actually the most successful phase when it comes to attacks. This is the one that gets used most commonly, okay? So the simple one is you basically bring out the Trojan Defense. This is where you say, yes, my computer downloaded child pornography, but it was not me, it was a program on my computer. A variation on this is, it was not me, it was an invisible Trojan that you can't find because it deleted itself and someone's just out to get me. This is essentially the Wookiee defense of the intrusion of the InfoSec security, right? And the scary thing is there's now a precedent for it in the UK. So if you get busted in the UK, you can try and use this. The guy who's going to be going against you, Neil Barrett, lost his last case against the invisible Trojan defense. So you've got pretty good odds. The easiest technique, actually, is to just go after the judge and the jury. These people are not technical. They've got AOL accounts, and they have their secretaries print out their email for them. If you come out there and you can basically tell him that there's a whole bunch of big scary words and that he doesn't really understand what's going on, and you target it like that, you're pretty likely to get off. Judges really don't like the idea that there's reasonable doubt out there. So if you can come up with something that sounds reasonable and raises doubt, you're probably going to get off. As a result, all of this forensics evidence that gets captured is usually irrelevant in terms of prosecuting the case. Usually the forensics evidence is used in terms of coming up with like the number of counts of an incident or something like that. It's not going to be what they rely on to get a conviction. It's going to be what they use to get a conviction for 15 counts rather than 3 counts. Most trials rely on confession. All right? Cops are very, very good social engineers. So there's one I know in the UK who says, I'm a salesman. My job is to sell people jail sentences. So he will sit around and he'll just talk to people, and eventually they'll confess to what they've done. This happened to a friend of mine where he got busted. This is the Whitechapel one. He got busted for attacking a tsunami site by putting in ... in the URL and trying to escape back up a level. And they decided that this was an attempt at an SQL injection, and that because he got a 404 page back, he had access to the system. Okay, they're prosecuting this, and they can't believe while he's fighting it. The one cop said, it's an open and shut case. He admitted to putting the ... in the field. All right? So these guys are not very bright. They don't actually understand what they're looking at. So you've got a reasonable chance of getting off there as long as you don't tell them anything. So understanding the forensics process and some of its weaknesses, we can now look at broad strategies, right? And the broad strategies are pretty simple. It's data destruction, data hiding, and data contraception. In principle, the only thing we need to remember is data is evidence. So anytime they get a hold of data, it might be used as evidence against you. So the trick is to minimize the amount of data that they have access to and to minimize the value of that data so that they can't actually use it in any way. So let's look at data destruction. Data destruction is actually a little bit more complicated than it sounds. Like simply, I'm sure we're all aware that simply using RM or something else to delete a file is ineffective. It only removes references to that file from the directory structure. It doesn't actually remove the file from the file system. It remains on the disk. So there's actually two areas of that file that we need to worry about when we're deleting. The first area is the user content. That's the actual file content that we've created. So we need to make sure that that's gone. Then the second stuff that we need to worry about is all the metadata about that file, such as the times, the owner, the permissions, and the references to it from the directory structure. So we need to make sure that we thoroughly eradicate both of these sets of data. We have to get rid of it completely. We have to get rid of it so completely that they can't tell that it was actually deleted, which means that we have to make sure that when we delete something, it looks like it never existed to begin with, rather than that it was simply overwritten. We will look at how we can do that as well. One of the other techniques you can use, of course, is altering file system metadata. So you can alter the timestamps of files to bring everything back to prior to when an incident occurred. This is ancient stuff. It's been done since the early 90s on Unix. Apparently at 0 day on NTFS, though. You can restore file systems to the pre-file state. This is what you want to be doing. You want to be making it look like the file system never had the file to begin with, which is usually quite difficult, particularly on more complex file systems. It's pretty straightforward on Unix because it's very simple. We'll look at the techniques that we do for that. End result, file systems are not secure. They're not trusted, and they're not a log of file system activity. You can trust them as much as you can trust syslog that's stored in plain text on the disk, right? No one over here is going to trust that after an intrusion, right? Okay. If you do, could you give me your IP addresses, please? Okay. So we can destroy things and make sure there's nothing there to be found. We can also hide things. But when it comes to hiding things, we have to be very clear on how we're going to do it. There's a set of requirements that we need to be aware of in order to come up with a good data hiding attack. So the first one is obviously it needs to be covert, right? If it's not actually hidden, it doesn't count as a data hiding attack. I had a friend who told me that his super elite technique was placing a dot in front of the file names that he wanted to hide. This is not a very covert attack. More reliable, of course, is exploiting bugs in forensics tools. So if we can find ways that tools don't work properly, and we can find ways of exploiting those bugs, we can store things in an area that's invisible to the guy who's doing the analysis. This is what we want to do. We want to make sure that he won't even find what he's looking for because his tool can't look there. Unfortunately, like with all bugs, there's a lifespan. Fortunately, though, in the case of forensics tool, the lifespan is very long. So one of the attacks I'm going to talk about, RuneFS, I published the bug in, I forget when, frac something or other. It took them 9 months to fix the bug, which was a single line of source code that they needed to change. All right? So anything out there, it's not going to get patched for a very, very long time. As far as I'm aware, the other techniques I'm going to show you, I've been doing them at Black Hat for about a year now, and they're still unpatched. Right? So these attacks are really good in that you're going against people who don't understand that security needs to be fixed. Okay, so we got bugs that we can exploit. We've got covertness, but we also need reliability. Right? We want to be able to put our data in and then get it back out again. if we wanted to put it in and maybe we don't get it out again, we'd be looking at a data destruction attack, right? We'd be looking at some way of eradicating it beforehand. Okay, so we need it to be reliable. We don't want our data to disappear. We also need it to be secure. We want to make sure that no one's going to be accessing it except us, and that the only way that we're going to access it is with our specific tools. And finally, we're not stupid, so we're going to encrypt. So before anything hits the disk, we make sure that it's encrypted. So even if it's not covert enough, they fix the bugs, and, well, we can skip reliability. Even if they actually do find it, they can't do anything with it because it's encrypted. All right, so I've come up with a methodology for how we can approach data hiding. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to talk about fisting. Fisting is the file system insertion and subversion technique. So fisting is inserting data into places it doesn't belong. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is data storage in metadata portions of the file system. This is quite dangerous. We're going to be modifying portions of the file system that is not meant to be modified. So we're going to be looking at modifying journals. We're going to be looking at modifying directory files. For instance, on Windows, you can modify OLE2 files, which are document formats. It's a pretty powerful technique, but it is dangerous. So you have to remember, obey the FISC. Okay, so right now you're probably wondering, what holes can I fist? Well, if we look at a broad idea of what a file system specification looks like, we've got this big green box. Everything in here is a valid implementation of the file system specification. Then we're going to have FSCK, the file system checker. This is going to implement a very, very broad spectrum of the file system specification to make sure that the file system is consistent and can be used properly by other pieces of software. Then you're going to have your forensics tool, which is going to implement a subset of the file system specification because that's all it needs to do. But it's also going to overlap a little bit and implement some stuff that isn't in FSCK, such as access to deleted content. And then finally, you're going to have the kernel. And the kernel is going to, once again, overlap quite a bit and implement a broad spectrum of the file system specification. And it's going to implement things that the other tools don't, such as allocation for new files and writing to disk and so on. But as you've noticed, you can fist here. So that's fisting. It's a powerful methodology for attacking the forensics process. You can use fisting on just about anything. It's effective against most forensics analysis. It's effective against all forensics tools. We'll be looking at some implementations in a minute. But to get back to the broad strategies, if we look at the next one, data contraception. So even though we've got data destruction and data hiding, these are not the ultimate attacks. The ultimate attack is not creating any data in the first place. Okay, so there's two techniques to practice safe hacking and implement data contraception. You can reduce the quantity of data that's left behind. So that means that you minimize your disk activity. That means you don't access files, you don't read things from the disk, you don't write things to the disk. And you can use an evidence prophylactic. So we're going to look at several types of evidence prophylactic which are out there, and I'm going to talk about certain implementations. And finally, we can reduce the quality of the data that's left behind, which means that rather than using our own specifically developed tool or technique, we're going to use tools which exist on the system. So we're going to use things which exist everywhere rather than things that we write ourselves. So in terms of reducing quantity, we can use things such as non-evidentiary rootkits and backdoors. These are very common on Windows. They've been more common on Unix for a long time. It basically means in-memory patching. This is something we're all familiar with, kernel-level rootkits that hop straight into memory through dev-kmem or however they get there. It means executing binaries straight in memory. So rather than creating something, uploading it to the disk, and then executing it using the kernel's file system execution, rather than using the kernel's binary file execution implementation, we're going to use our own. And that's fairly easy to do. I wrote UL exec in a weekend, so it's not very difficult. In terms of using scripting, this is really straightforward. I'm not sure why more people don't do it or whatever. But basically, all scripted interpreters accept standard in for input. So why should we bother uploading our file with all of our script commands to disk and then executing it there when we can fire up the interpreter and then paste the entire script in over standard in, right? In this case, it's going to execute purely in memory. It's going to be compiled on the fly by the interpreter, and it's going to be run from memory rather than written to disk, so there's nothing left behind. All right? Who's that? There's always one. Okay. So in terms of reducing the quantity, we need to be aware that there are several different ways that we can use an evidence prophylactic. And basically what an evidence prophylactic does is it prevents us from interacting directly with the operating system. It provides a sort of protective sheath or a layer around us so that we can operate in a safe environment in a sort of shim. So the ones I'm going to talk about are IUDs. IUDs are, So IUDs are inter or intra-userland devices. So these are things which allow you to interact with the memory space almost without the operating system interfering. It's a piece of code that you have that will execute a sort of virtual memory environment or a virtual machine that you can execute in there. The usual ways of implementing this are process puppeteering, such as MostF or Core SDI's Impact. The Meterpreter is similar. There's private stuff as well out there. But basically what you do is you have a virtual machine that's executing in memory. It does what it needs to do. It never interacts with the disk. It provides a wrapper so that you aren't calling system calls directly, so that you don't need to use execve, you don't need to use fork. It's going to wrap all of this stuff for you and limit the amount of data that gets left behind in the machine. In terms of reducing quality, we've already talked about this a little bit. Basically what you want to be doing is using common tools. Common tools reveal very, very little about their purpose. So when I implemented my IUD, I used GDB as my backend. This meant that I didn't actually have to write any code other than a small amount of text to interact with GDB to create a process space. All right? And it means that we start doing things that are built from shell scripts rather than from C or from another compiled language, so that we can execute things via scripted interpreters over standard in and without writing anything to disk. So now we're going to look at some attacks. What do I have up there? Yeah, file system attacks gone wild, live and uncensored. So we're going to look at the three areas that we can interact with a PC to limit forensics analysis. So the first area is actually below the file system. We're going to look at partition table attacks, how we can attack the way that the person using the forensic software is going to view the disk and the areas that they're going to be looking at. We're then going to look at attacks within the file system. So we're going to look at file system implementation bugs in forensic software and how we can exploit that. We're going to be using ext2fs as an example because ext2fs is really simple and I can explain it in about 10 minutes and you'll all be experts. And then we're going to look at stuff beyond the file system. So this is where we don't even touch the disk. So we're going to look a little bit more in depth at how we can do in-memory process executions. So deep disking, it came from below the file system. Deep disking is basically partition table attacks. So the partition table, as you know, exists below the file system. It's a piece of code or a couple of data structures which tell software that interacts with the hard disk how to treat it, how to treat chunks of it as portions of a file system or as portions of a separate disk that they can interact with. I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with the idea of partitions. The important things to remember, a partition table structure only has meaning for the software that interacts with it. And there's a limited number of software that interacts with it properly. So there's basically three things that we worry about. There's operating systems, so we need to make sure that when we modify it, we don't actually damage how the operating system operates. There's disk editors. Disk editors do quite a bit on the file system, but they're usually run once during system creation time rather than repeatedly. And we need to worry about forensics tools, which is obviously our end target. Okay, so these are pretty good attacks. If we look at the pros, they're file system neutral, which means that we can change the file system at any point in time and continue to use the attack. There are good attacks on the integrity of a forensics tool. So they actually attack it at a lower layer than the simple file system implementation. Usually forensics tools just dive straight in and they treat the partition table as something that they can basically ignore and they just start looking directly at the file system. This is great for us. Right? So file systems are usually heavily implemented and the partition tables are taken for granted. It's not all peaches though. There's a few problems. It's complex and dangerous to actually implement this stuff because you tend to be fucking about with your operating system. And it's a really good way of losing a lot of data. So these are not useful attacks in a post-operating system installation environment. So once you've built your system, it's too late. This is something you have to plan beforehand, which means that if you hack into a box, you can't really do this. right? You have to build it on your home system, or you have to repartition the box that you've hacked into, and that gets ugly. There's a high chance of data loss. Like if you make any mistakes here, or any of the software gets updated later down the line, like you get a patch in your kernel, and it starts treating your partition table differently, you stand a good chance of losing everything. And yeah, this breaks operating systems, particularly DOS, but that's not very important. So if we look at the partition table layout, I'm going to try and skip through most of this because it's a bit dry and these slides aren't very good. I should have gotten the dudes who did the NTFS talk to do my slides. The partition table is comprised of a number of partition vectors. These vectors can contain up to 4 entries. Each entry is basically a start and a stop, or a start and a size, and you just calculate off of that. The first partition vector, which is the first entry, is called the master partition table. And after that, you have what's called extended partitions or logical partitions. It gets very irritating because they interchange extended and logical, and they mean different things depending on how they're used in context. Basically, this is what it looks like. The white bit is your master partition table, and it will have pointers to the other partition tables. The yellow bit is actually the start of your big blue arrow, and that's going to be your extended partition table. It will have a pointer to the pink bit, which will then have a pointer to the other color, which will then have a pointer to null at the end. So you basically follow a linked list where there's one entry that says this is a partition, and there's one entry that says this is how you find the next partition. That means that for each of these vectors, we actually have 4 empty spaces, right? Because we have 2 empty spaces. Out of the 4, only 2 are used. This is what our structure looks like. All the stuff with the XXX next to it is pornography. It's ignored. It's crap. You don't need to worry about that. This is for back when you actually had to store your disk image geometry on disk so that your operating system could interact with it. All the stuff that gets used is basically type, which tells you whether it's a swap partition or exe2 or NTFS or whatever. The number of sectors in the first sector. Active is a real old holdover. It tells you whether it's bootable or not. If you use Grugq or anything intelligent, it doesn't really matter that much. So anyway, that's our basic introduction to partition tables. If we look at some attacks, we've got, for instance, excessive partition tables. So we can have a very large number of partition tables in the linked list. The reason this is effective is most people, when they implement their partition table software, make an assumption. For instance, there will never be more than 80 partitions. They then create a fixed buffer for pointers to each of these partition structures, and then they follow the linked list one at a time. You can have extra extended partition table vector entries. So as we were saying, out of those 4 entries that get used, the first one points to an actual partition. The second one points to the next partition over, and there's 2 blank entries. We can obviously fill those entries in. We can use errors in table alignment, so we can have partition tables that don't start and stop next to each other. We can have gaps, right? Those gaps can obviously be excellent places for storing data, particularly if no one does any analysis to ensure that the partition table is sane. And as a subtle hint, no one ever does any analysis to ensure that the partition table is sane. And then obviously we can fist the partition table. So here's an assumption. There will never be more than n number of partition tables. Why is this invalid? Well, because we can create as many as we like, obviously. You're going to get one of 2 different types of errors. Number one is you're going to get a buffer overflow. I haven't actually found this to be the case. Usually what I find is that it errors out. It says something like, more than 80 partitions found, erroring out. That's not very helpful for someone trying to conduct an analysis. We can have extra extended partition tables, so we can have extra space that points to, we can have extra entries which point to new partitions. And when someone goes through and they're looking at it, if they make the assumption that only the first 2 entries are valid, they can find the space. Typically, forensics officers know about this attack. Actually, on Linux and on Windows 2000 and up, these extra partition tables will show up under your disk image. So it will actually see them and create partitions for them that you can access. Yeah. It can sometimes work. Usually it doesn't. People aren't that stupid. Errors in table alignment. Usually the assumption is that the sum of all partitions is accurate as the total size of the actual disk. That doesn't necessarily need to be the case. so we can create misalignments. We can actually cause buffer overflows and buffer underflows based on how all of this is treated, which I haven't found too many instances of that. It's usually been in really, really crappy, cheap shareware tools, so we can ignore that for a minute. We can actually create restorable logical partitions. This is a very, very popular technique amongst pedophiles. What they'll do is they'll create their disk image, and they'll take the very, very last partition. They'll write down where it starts and how big it is, and then they'll use a disk editor to delete it. Then when they want to access their data, they will remount the disk, they will edit it, they will add their partition back in, they'll reboot, they'll go and they'll copy all their data around, then they'll edit it again, take it back out, and bounce the box. As a result, it's not a very effective technique because people know to look for it. We can fist the partition table. The partition table is actually offset from the start of the partition. Each of those partition vectors is 64 sectors away from the start of a partition, which gives us some space. There's space within the actual structure itself. That's 446 bytes. It's not a lot of space. You can store a password in there, I guess. You get about 32K per extended partition. So we can combine these attacks with some other ones and possibly get up to about a meg of space. It's not going to be that great. It's not very, very good for high-capacity storage. Which brings us on to attacks within the file system. So we're going to be looking at file system fisting. How to destroy your file system in just a few easy steps. So we can come in at various different layers, and in order for us to understand that, I'm going to have to explain file systems. So if you bear with me for a minute. Basically, at the file system layer, you have metadata for the operating system. So this is information about the layout and the content and the size of the file system that the operating system will then use when it's accessing all of the content and when it's mounting the file system. You have the content layer, which stores all of the actual content for the user files. You have a metadata layer, which organizes all of those data units and all that content together into actual files, and will also store additional information such as timestamps and so on. And then you have the name layer. And the name layer will basically pair metadata units with file names so that you can actually reference things as lost and found rather than inode 11. Okay, so this is your Unix file system. You've got a superblock, a block, an inode, and a dictionary file. The idea is that the block is a number of sectors that's fixed together. It's a fixed length. You address it. It's stored in a table. You say block 1, 2, whatever. We refer to these as block pointers. You just get used to that. Metadata information is stored in an inode. An inode is one per file. They're unique. They're not reused while the file system is in use, or sorry, while the inode is in use. They can be reused if it gets deleted. This will store reference counts, owners, groups, permissions, timestamps. As we saw before, MAC times, the modification, access, and change times. On Unix, it'll also store, on Linux, under exe2fs, it'll store a deletion time, which is useful. And then it will store a list of data blocks, which will be your actual content. And we'll look at how that's implemented right now. It's stored essentially as a very flexible array of block pointers. So you start out with a number of direct block pointers, which tell you where the data units are. Then you have indirect block pointers, which are an extension to that array. They basically point to a block that stores further direct block pointers. Then you have a doubly indirect block, which acts as a list of indirect block pointers. And then you have a trebly indirect block, which stores a list of pointers to doubly indirect blocks to indirect blocks to direct blocks, of course. So this is a very, very cheesy graphic of how it looks. You have your direct block pointers at the beginning, and they point to actual user content. Then you have a pointer to an indirect block, which will have pointers to direct blocks further out. That's that. So this is how those inodes are linked to file names with directory files. This is essentially the structure of the elements in the array which makes up the dictionary file. You have a few key elements. You've got an inode, which is the inode of the file. You've got a name length, which tells you the length of the name. You've got the name array, which stores the name of the file. And then you have the record length. The record length tells you how big this particular structure is. And the reason that this exists is because when we delete a file, we actually increment the preceding record length to now include the deleted file. Excuse me. So this is what we're going to have. For instance, we would have inode 11 as lost and found with a record length of 16. We then have a lame file as inode 13 with, again, a record length of 16. Then some file with inode 12, and it would now have a record length of 32 because the deleted file over here is now no longer going to be accessible to the operating system. It's going to use the record length to iterate over these, and it's going to bounce right past. We will see how this can be used in attacks against forensics tools. So when we look at attacks, there's 4 basic ones I'm going to talk about. There's RuneFS, which is the very first one I did back in 1999. It uses the bad blocks inode to store data. We're going to look at WaffenFS, which uses a spoofed journal file. We're going to look at KYFS, which uses null directory entries. And then we're going to look at DataMuleFS, which uses padding and reserved data. So the RuneFS basically exploited a bug in TCT where it assumed that the start of the file system, the start of the directory structure, which was inode 2, was the very first valid inode on the file system. That's incorrect. The first valid inode is actually inode number 1. So there was a bug which allowed you to access, which basically prevented the forensics analyst from accessing your data. It couldn't see below inode number 2. This was the code that they had, roughly. It was if less than root inode or greater than last inode, return bad inode. So our implementation is very, very simple. We just use a regular data file. We'd use our own implementation of ext2 to access the disk directly. We could store as much as we liked, basically. I think we topped out at 2 to 4 gigs. WaffenFS, on the other hand, is a more sophisticated fisting attack. We basically take an ext2 file system, and we add a new metadata structure to it, which is a journal. And this creates an ext3 file system. Now, as it happens, the kernel determines the file system type not based on the headers or the actual content of the file system, but rather on the entries in the etcfs tab. Unfortunately, FSCK doesn't have the privilege of using the etcfs tab, so it has to use the information on the file system itself. So you now have a situation where the kernel and the FSCK are viewing the file system differently. You then have these forensics tools which claim to implement ext3, but they actually only implement ext2. They treat the journal file as just some sort of unknown metadata structure that they'll do analysis on to see if there might possibly be stored inodes or something, but they won't look at it otherwise as a possible data store. As a result, you have a situation where these 3 pieces of software are treating the file system differently, and you can exploit that hole. Unfortunately, you usually only get about 32 megs, which is actually a huge amount depending on what you're trying to store. The next attack, KYFS, is kill your file system. I had a really bad time implementing this one, and I lost quite a bit of data by accident. It was 40 gigs worth of DVDs. Anyway, what we do is we utilize null directory entries. Null directory entries are basically fake deleted files that allow us to take up a block in a directory file to the kernel. So we create a directory entry which looks like this. We use an inode value of 0, which is a flag to the kernel to say this is a deleted directory entry. We then set the record length of the directory entry to the size of a block. So we can take up an entire block with this record entry. We set the name length to 0, and we set the name to our actual data. So we lose, I think, 8 bytes of data storage space, and we gain an entire block. And the beauty of it is, you're not limited to doing this once per directory file. You can create as many of these together as you like. So you can actually create unlimited file system space for data storage. So the way that the kernel will look at the directory file is something like this. It'll have a directory pointer, which will point to the beginning of the block. While that pointer is less than the end of that block, it will simply add the directory, the current directory entry's record length. Then, if the inode value is 0, it will loop to the next one. This is pretty simple to get by. We set our inode value to 0 and our record length to 1 block. The forensics tool code, on the other hand, will specifically look for a deleted inode value, and then it will look for a name length to indicate there's a name to extract. So there's no points for figuring out how we can bypass this one. Okay, so that was KYFS. The next one is DataMuleFS, which is similar to a drug mule in that you force data into something and then you extract it later. You basically use metadata structure, padding, and reserved areas for data storage. Now, on all file systems, they'll have some areas left over for future expansion, except on NTFS where they fucked up and they ran out of space and they had to do some side stuff to create extra area. What this allows us to do is use the reserved space, which is not going to be touched by the kernel or by the file system checker or even by the forensics tools, because they're going to ignore this. They're going to be looking for the actual data. They're going to be looking at MAC times. They're not going to be looking at the reserved space in that inode. This is a beautiful technique. Unfortunately, it got publicized by some people, so I had to make it public. It was very, very effective, and it still remains so because there's no really good tools out there to detect this stuff. If we look for the amount of space that we can get using this attack on ext2, we see that the superblock will give us 759 bytes of space. A group descriptor will give us 14 bytes of space, and an inode will give us about 10 bytes. So for every 1 gig of space on an ext2 file system using the default 4K block size, we end up with, you can see the numbers up there, but basically we end up with about a megabyte of space in inodes alone that we can then use. So for every gig that you have on your file system, you now have 1 meg of hidden data storage space. So those are several implementations of attacks against file systems. We can now move beyond file systems, and we can look at things that we can do simply in memory. So classic implementations of in-process execution are mostf and syscall proxying from Core Impact. Metasploit obviously has the Meterpreter, which falls into this category, and there's also some private tools out there which do similar techniques. In-memory execution stuff that was developed specifically to attack the forensics process would be rexec, which I released last year, I think. I can't really remember. And ftrans, which was developed by the FRAC High Council and released about a week after I released userland exec. Ftrans was billed as anti-honeypot technology, which is basically anti-forensics technology in a very, very forensically hostile environment. Personally, I think there's a lot better attacks against honeypots because CBEC has buffer overflows in the kernel. GDB-based process puppeteering, right? So you can use common tools rather than custom tools. ftrans was based on using a custom tool as a server at the remote end. I prefer to use GDB. You can use shell scripts rather than custom tools again. As a result, you minimize the amount of stuff that you have to upload. You minimize the amount of disk activity that you need to generate. I've seen all sorts of stuff implemented in shell scripts. I've seen file system preservation tools. These will go through and they will scan the file system. After you've conducted your intrusion, you'll then scan the file system to see its current state. You'll then store that state. You'll conduct your backdooring or your installation of whatever, and then you will then restore the state of the file system to the pre-intrusion or just immediately post-intrusion state. So it speeds up your cleanup, and this has been done just with shell scripts. There's also shell script log cleaners and shell script backdoors. So for instance, we can use Grugq to create a backdoor. For some reason, the GNU people thought that you needed to have socket capabilities in a text editing tool. I don't know, GNU's not useful. So we can create, I don't know how many lines it is. It's less than 20 lines, and this is a complete backdoor that will listen on a port, accept commands, execute them, and return them. And obviously, we could fire up Grugq locally and then just cut and paste this in, and it will run purely in memory. Okay, that's it. Forensics is vulnerable. It's not secure. There's a lot of different ways that we can defeat forensics technology, primarily going after the process or the tools or possibly the end game when we end up in court. File systems are not an accurate log of system activity. They cannot be trusted. And finally, we've owned your file system. Questions? Yo. Only crack boxes with at least 2 gigabytes of RAM. Now, you can't be sure that that won't happen, but what tends to happen is things which are used very, very frequently, such as bash or other system-level activities, are kept in RAM rather than swapped out, right? So as long as you're not using a huge amount of data, all of your code pages are going to remain in RAM, and your data pages are probably going to remain there as well. That's the probable likelihood. On the other hand, cleaning up the swap file system is actually very simple. There's just a bitmap at the beginning of the swap file that says which pages are in use, and you could go through and you could blank everything that's no longer in use. That's not too bad. Ew.
Well, most of your tools are designed for you to line the file system, hide around the files and things like this, so that tools that rely on just the file system to report the existence of size of files. How about just raw analysis of the disk, like got DD, dev, HDA, and you just feel the tools are so unsophisticated at that level, like disk carving tools that.
Well, okay, so the question is basically like, what about raw disk analysis rather than interpreting the file system? My answer would be, if you want to look at 80 gigabytes of hex in a hex editor, you're welcome to do it. But I think that your odds of finding something are actually lower than if you were to use a forensics tool. So once you use DD to create an image of the file system, you'll then actually need to use some sort of tool to analyze that file system and convert it into something that's actually useful, to extract the metadata and the data and to try and figure out what the fuck is going on. What I'm saying is that the tools which do that are poorly implemented and have a lot of bugs which are not being searched for and are not being addressed properly, which means that you can actually exploit those bugs to bypass the analysis phase. So you don't need to worry about people finding your stuff, even though they have a full DD image. That said, there are certain tools like Foremost which will ignore file system context and just try and extract directly the file content. The way that you can bypass that is to make sure that what you're storing is encrypted so that anything that's doing direct analysis will be looking at random binary data that it's not going to be able to determine is something malicious, random, or whatnot. Cool. Anything else? Yo. No, not specifically. I did do some work on developing a secure Linux, which would be based on a Knoppix distribution with 2 USB keys, one for an encrypted home partition and one for keys. So you would basically boot up with both of them plugged in, then you pull out the key USB, and you could chuck that later to make sure that if someone were to capture your USB with the real data, it wouldn't be available for analysis. But I haven't looked specifically at USB. Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of like new file systems starting to appear on Linux, like XFS, JFS, RicerFS, and so on. Basically, they're kind of difficult to implement, and as a result, a lot of the forensics tools don't bother. So one of the great ways of avoiding forensic analysis is if you use RicerFS. Most forensics tools don't support RicerFS, so I use it on all my home partitions. They're going to be stuck with strings and grep at that point. There's not a lot that they can do. In terms of BSD file systems are actually very similar to the ext2 file system. However, there are variations between the Solaris implementation and the different like OpenBSD, NetBSD, and FreeBSD. In fact, FreeBSD even has 2 separate implementations that differ slightly on disk. Interesting side note, actually, there's a really cool attack that just came out with Solaris 10 where they have something called extended attributes, which basically means that in every inode, there's a value which will be an inode, another inode number, which points to a directory which stores files about that, that file that you're looking at. As far as I know, no one knows to actually look there. So when I found this out like last year, I started telling all my friends, and you can actually use CP to do very, very effective data storage on a Solaris system, just because it now has support in the kernel for a cool data hiding attack that the forensics tools don't support. But yeah, like these attacks, the specific implementations won't work, but there's similar attacks that will work on other file systems. Cool. Anything else? Sorry, mate? I still can't hear you. Well, you develop a tool that can both read and write. So essentially, the idea is that when you store the data on the disk, you'll be executing your tool in memory. So you'll copy it up into RAM. You'll run it there. It will interact with the file system. It'll take your data off the network, off the wire, chuck it in there, and then it will vanish when you're done. And then when you come back, you do the same process in reverse. So you load your tool up into memory, you access your hidden data area, possibly using a password to decrypt it first, and then you chuck it back out over the network, or you execute it in memory, or you do whatever it is that you need to do with it. But it is literally just the tool development that you use. Yep. As far as I understand, they're no longer being maintained. The last one I knew about was Rubber Hose, which stopped at like 2.2.16 or something like that. It had some problems in terms of the implementation, and it also had some problems in terms of its assumptions to begin with. So the basic idea with Rubber Hose was that there was a partition with a file system that could have any of, I believe the number was 16, but there's basically multiple different views of the file system based on the password that you give it when you try and access it. So conceptually what you would do is you'd create several different views of this file system with several different varying layers of security. So the first one would just be like your basic pornography, then you'd have your bestiality, and then you'd have another one with whatever else. And what would happen is they would catch you and they'd start beating you and they'd say, give us your password, and you go, okay, you got me. Here's the password to my first partition. And you'd give that out as if you'd now leaked all the goods, and they'd be able to go through and they'd get your pornography. And they go, okay, well, I guess you're hiding your pornography, which kind of makes sense, but we can't bust you for it, so you're okay. And then if they didn't believe you and they keep beating you, then you give them the second one. And they can now find your bestiality and go, well, he's probably really embarrassed about this stuff, so they won't prosecute. In practice, that doesn't tend to be very effective, particularly because if they're beating the shit out of you, you're going to tell them absolutely fucking everything as quickly as you can. And the other one is they're actually really, really effective social engineers. So if you're talking to them at all, you're going to spill the beans, which is why I say, like, just don't talk to them. I mean, if you have no choice, it means they're beating you. Otherwise, you don't have to say anything. And I've seen these guys in action. They're absolutely amazing. Like, I was with some cops, and they rocked up to, like, we were at the pub and whatever. So 11 o'clock comes out. We get kicked out. We're wandering around. We find an Indian restaurant. The manager is outside locking the door. One of the cops rocks up. He starts talking to him. Ends out, the manager unlocks the store, goes back in, calls the chef, and he starts cooking up eggs for everyone and gets out more beers. I mean, like, he convinced the guy that what he wanted to do was reopen his restaurant and give us food. And he didn't even flash his badge or anything. Like, these dudes will get absolutely anything out of you, so don't talk to them. Yeah. Especially if you're in an Indian restaurant. Anything else? You don't actually use inodes. That's the beauty of it. You just use the actual directory file itself for the data storage. So the directory file holds your data, right? So unless they're doing thorough analysis on your directory files, they won't find the data at all. As far as they're concerned, as long as it doesn't contain a deleted file name, it's not interesting. So the analysis that tends to get done on directory files is more for information about files that used to exist rather than for a place of data storage. You can, like, the implementation I have does some pretty cool, like, spanning tree type stuff where it, like, spreads out and all the stuff. And you basically just give it a root directory and it follows everything down and just adds extra space to all the directory files it finds. So if you pick a good directory, something that is not updated frequently, something that is basically left as is, such as hypothetically user share locale, you will get 72 entries for, like, all of the different locales which are supported, and each of those will be a separate directory, and no one ever fucking looks in there. All right. Anything else? Nope. Cool, we're done. Thank you.